Senanayake, State Minister of Foreign Affairs, to deliver his address.
Acting Foreign Secretary, Mr. Ravinath Arisinghe. State Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mrs. Grace Asirwada. Mr. Nakandala, Dr. Vignaraja, and Mrs. Pamela Dean, and Mr. Kapila Fonseca. And of course, our distinguished guests, diplomats from all over the world, from very many countries. I believe there are 23 countries. Welcome to all of you. It is my great pleasure and privilege to address you here and to welcome you. You come from near and far. You represent different continents of the globe. And you have come here in the spirit of advancing and sharing knowledge in the field of diplomacy. And I would hope that after this session is concluded, you would have got to know Sri Lanka a little bit better, that this session has proved to be one that bonds all of you, helps you in interacting with each other, and develops a feeling of amity between nations. I think the objective of this program is precisely that. Economic diplomacy, as I see it, is the artful skill of protecting a nation's assets and economic avenues through consolidation of international goodwill and friendships. Sri Lanka is a country that has come to this juncture in time and in history, arrived at this particular place internationally, diplomatically, culturally, due to the extraordinary circumstances that have shaped the island's history and culture. Sri Lanka, geographically speaking, is a little island south of the southernmost tip of India. That itself has shaped Sri Lanka's way of thinking, acting, and positioning itself. When you are a little island positioned so close to the vast subcontinent of India, it has its pluses and minuses. But the good relationship of our two countries and good diplomatic practices have allowed Sri Lanka to benefit from being at the southernmost tip of the subcontinent of India. India emerges not merely as a regional power, but as a global one. And its neighbors, using the situation intelligently, using the circumstances intelligently, should be able to benefit from India's transformation of a country that was not, well, let us not say ignored, but not from a country that was not considered too seriously 25 years ago to becoming a country that nobody can ignore or avoid in the present circumstances. So Sri Lanka has had the cultural, trade, and other benefits by being situated so close to India. but also by being so closely developed, by being so closely associated with the ancient world, the developed world of ancient times, of having had the privilege of trading with countries like Syria in the most ancient times, Egypt, Mesopotamia, having had the strongest links with Persia, of ancient Rome, and as numerous sources of porcelain, ancient coins, and pottery show us, with an enduring friendship with China. These strong relationships in the ancient world has made Sri Lanka what Sri Lanka is today. Sri Lanka, as you may know, was called many names throughout history. During the colonial period when we were under British colonial rule, we were known as Ceylon. And Ceylon tea and Ceylon cinnamon have gained worldwide reputation for excelling in those two areas of tea production and cinnamon production. And that brand today is still known as Ceylon tea or Ceylon cinnamon. Then, of course, Ceylon in the times of the ancient Dutch and the Portuguese, when we were a colony of the Portuguese first in 1505, and then a colony of Holland. We were known as Taprobani to the ancient Romans. We were known as Serendib to the ancient Arab world. And in fact, much of the ancient Arab world speaks of having got precious stones, ivory, and of having got the best swords in the world from ancient Serendip, which was Sri Lanka. This reflects Sri Lanka's position as an ancient port and a cultural hotspot, a melting pot of cultures that arrived in Sri Lanka. The Arabs arrived in Sri Lanka, traded here. Colonial powers came here in search of spices. In fact, the Portuguese first landed in Sri Lanka because they wanted to get a monopoly on the cinnamon trade that was very famous in Sri Lanka. The Persians arrived here. The Chinese did extensive trade here, and Sri Lanka was regarded as a part of the ancient Chinese Silk Route that linked east and west. Sri Lanka found its way into the first map of the world, into Ptolemy's map, which was made in the 2nd century. Sri Lanka also found itself into that map. This shows the extent of which the world was knowledgeable about Sri Lanka as a trading hub and its unique geographical position and situation. It was right in the middle of ancient shipping lanes. It is right in the middle of modern shipping lanes as well. Sri Lanka also has the advantage of having deep water harbors, which is absent in most other parts of the region, which gives it another unique advantage. Again, one of the most developing areas in the world, and an area that will undoubtedly develop in the future, is the African continent. Today, one of the most significant global powers is China. Africa is the source of most of the world's raw materials as it stands today. Sri Lanka stands in that natural shipping route between China and the eastern part of Africa. This is another area that we should and we will concentrate on as a country when developing Sri Lanka as a potential hub in this region. Economic diplomacy established itself in the world for several reasons. Firstly, countries needed to be secure in food. And when countries that were not self-sufficient, most countries are not self-sufficient in food, realized the need or dependence on other countries to trade, there had to be a necessity to bring about diplomatic relations between that country, because one needed to be secure in firstly in food. Then, of course, next came trade and prosperity. With trading with nations also brought prosperity. And in order to facilitate more trade and keep trading partners happy, one needed to develop good relationships. Then, of course, a third point is to increase one's own global footprint, to try to expand one's businesses. For instance, take a country like Sri Lanka, our market is only 22 million people. If we can trade wisely with India, our neighbor, that's 1.2 billion people. How much more of a global footprint that is. Today, Sri Lankan companies that excel in trades like the garment trade invest in so many other countries, Bangladesh being one, many East African nations, and of course, now in the Caribbean as well. The Dominican Republic, which I had the great pleasure of visiting only a few days ago. Haiti, and other such countries. Then, of course, to counter geopolitical and international threats countries have. One may feel insecure due to various reasons. A country may feel threatened due to several reasons. This is why grouping together, having many international friends, is useful, because one is then not isolated if there is an issue. So this is another reason why diplomacy, and in particular economic diplomacy, is necessary between nations. In ancient times, this was of course secured through alliances of marriage. Various monarchs married monarchs of other countries, or the sisters or daughters of monarchs of other countries. This ensured a common bloodline. Often we did this with our neighbor India, with neighboring states of India. There was constant marriages between Sri Lankan royalty and the royalty of the Chola states, the Pandava states, and so on, in India. There was also marriages between Sri Lankan monarchs and the Srivijayan Empire. The Srivijayan Empire is what consists of modern-day Malaysia and Indonesia. Also between Myanmar and Sri Lanka. And there's also some evidence that princesses from Sri Lanka, historically, were also sent to Cambodia for the same purpose. So building up alliances with nations in the past, during the time of the monarchies, was done through marriages and dynastic lineages. I think that is the only modus operandi that has changed in today's world, because we don't, in today's world where absolute monarchies have gone out and different forms of government have come in, we do not have marriage alliances anymore. However, trade alliances between countries still remain very strong. In history, the court of Claudius Caesar, 41 to 54 AD, was one of the courts that Sri Lankan merchants found their goods supplied to. We were suppliers of pepper to ancient Rome, and the court of Claudius Caesar in between 41 to 54 AD was one such place that received Sri Lankan pepper on a regular basis, and it is in the Roman records, not in the Sri Lankan records. So this is from the writings of Pliny, who was a Roman author. But well before this establishment of contact with Europe, Sri Lanka enjoyed contact with the Middle East, definitely with India, with China. In fact, it is recorded that King Devanampiya Tissa sent a delegation to Pataliputra, to the court of Emperor Asoka of India, between 250 to 210 BC. That was the time frame of King Devanampiya Tissa's life. So it was during that time that that delegation was sent, and similar delegations came from India to Sri Lanka. In particular, the advent of Buddhism. When Emperor Asoka of India became a Buddhist, his first concern was his friend in Sri Lanka, because the kings, it is recorded that the two kings wrote letters to each other. As far back as 250 to 210 BC, they corresponded with each other. So which means that there was a common lingo that both understood. They were able to correspond with each other. They were able to read each other's letters. And as a result, when Emperor Asoka of India became a Buddhist, his son became a Buddhist Thera, and the Thera Mahenda, or a Buddhist priest, was the first ambassador of bringing Buddhism from India to Sri Lanka. Some 2,200 years later, Sri Lanka remains a country which is almost 75% Buddhist. This is another commonality we see in today's world as well. Trying to have other countries subscribe to your worldview or world vision. This was partly true even of the colonial era. It is true that most of the colonial countries came to our countries for commercial profit, but they also tried to indoctrinate their way of life. Sometimes they tried to erase a culture that was existing in a country. They tried to, in their minds, educate the local population with what was something better. Now, this was true with the Spanish in the Americas, when they brought a new culture, a new religion, a new tradition. Sometimes they had the effect of destroying entire libraries, entire civilizations that existed in those countries previously. So that was to some extent true even of the Portuguese arrival in Sri Lanka. But in their minds, they did this for the good of the people, for saving a heathen people and transforming them and bringing them in line with their own world vision. Now, this is to some extent what happened when Buddhism came from India to Sri Lanka. Of course, there was no prevalent religion or anything in Sri Lanka, so we were able to gladly receive what India sent us at that point. But in certain cultures, what happened was, when colonial influencers came, there was already an existing and established culture in that country, and there was active resistance to it. Like the Americas, where the Spanish culture was sometimes brutal and repressive. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was called, when the Portuguese arrived here. In more modern times, we can see the imposition of world vision and economic diplomacy and diplomacy in other forms taking place, aligning itself with that world vision. For instance, if I may explain myself, in 1948, when Sri Lanka got its independence from the British, the first Prime Minister, the Right Honourable D.S. Senanayake, affiliated himself with the British Commonwealth of Nations. That is, with countries like Canada, Australia, with some of the Caribbean islands which also had a British colonial past, some of the African countries which had a British colonial past. So the countries that had a British colonial past grouped together to form the British Commonwealth. And Sri Lanka was a very strong supporter of that idea of the British Commonwealth. Now, what that did was it alienated Sri Lanka from countries that didn't see itself with Britain, but strengthened our relationships with all those countries that saw itself as part of the British Commonwealth and shared that, and other countries that shared that system of values. One example of this was Sri Lanka's admission to the UN. The first round Sri Lanka applied to the UN, we were vetoed. We were vetoed by Russia because Russia didn't see itself or Sri Lanka as part of Russia's world order. So we had to ultimately reach a compromise. And in 1955, Russia agreed to field a couple of its satellite nations as candidates for the UNO. The United States agreed to not to object to those candidates if they didn't object to Ceylon. So it was a compromise. But then Sri Lanka didn't always have that world vision. During the time of the 60s, the world's first woman Prime Minister became Sri Lanka's Prime Minister, Mrs. Bandaranaike. She had more leanings towards the nations that were considered to have a socialist bent. And Sri Lanka was had a more socialist tilt in its policy. Now in this, Sri Lanka worked very closely with countries like China, with Russia, with Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, Cuba, and we developed close links with people who had, and countries that had common ideology. But we also were one of the founder members of what was known as the non-aligned movement, which was also born out of the Cold War that existed between Russia and America. This new idea that we don't want to be aligned to you or to you, although there were leanings, but we want to stay in the middle. And in this movement, countries like Bangladesh, India, all played Ghana, they all played a significant role. Today again, in more modern times, we see polarization of world opinion. There are some countries that believe all countries should have the same standard on rights for women. There are some countries that believe gay rights is a human right which should be acknowledged by all. And we also see the traditional religious and cultural arguments. Even though we live in today's century, the religious and cultural arguments that were strong hundreds of years ago still surface when we raise some of these issues of women's rights and gay rights, for example. So one of the more interesting countries that I was in a few days ago was Cuba, which is also having a referendum, I believe, on this same issue as to whether to allow gay marriage or not. And Cuba is a very strongly Catholic country. So it will be one of the most interesting debates that goes on in that country, and I'm personally very keen to follow what happens there. Sri Lanka, again, I was referring earlier to the Emperor Asoka. After the death of Emperor Asoka, India shifted back into becoming more Hindu in its outlook. But Sri Lanka retained the Buddhist philosophy that it inherited from India, and became the promoter of international Buddhism in many countries, and built up a strong link with nations like Thailand, with nations like Myanmar. In fact, the Bagan civilization of Myanmar was greatly influenced by Sri Lankan monks, and on my visit to Bagan about a year ago, I had the great privilege of seeing a lot of stories from the Sri Lankan canon, Mahavamsa, depicted in pictorial form in the temples of Bagan in Myanmar. So it is this sort of influencing of world vision is also a part of what we term as diplomacy, and is one of the areas that is most important and very crucial for countries to find commonality. Historical writings also show that Sri Lanka has lavished gifts to certain countries and to certain rulers. A 15th century record says that the Chinese emperor received baby elephants, golden aureoles, fine cotton cloth, gold, fragrances, black pepper, and medicines as gifts from Sri Lanka. It also says that in the 6th century, Parakram Bahu VI, you will be going to Polonnaruwa, which is one of our ancient kingdoms, and some of these kings actually reigned from those areas. And Parakram Bahu VI in particular gifted baby elephants, 200,000 pieces of teak wood, and 7 pearl divers to Persia or Iran. But what is interesting in both references is that we made these generous gifts to the Emperor of China. We made these generous gifts many hundreds of years before to the king of Persia. But was it just a gift of friendship? Or was there something more in that gesture? Is the question that I want to pose. I would venture to suggest that is an ideal example of commercial diplomacy being used many centuries ago. One doesn't hear of such generous gifts being given to the Maldives. One doesn't hear of such generous gifts being given to the Mauritius Islands. But one hears of it being given to China. One hears of the other gift being given to Iran. What does that show? China was, at that particular time in history, a global power, which it is now as well. And keeping China and the King of China happy, or the Emperor of China happy, facilitated better trade links, not only with China itself, but the entire route that was within the control of China. That entire shipping route, which also included modern-day Vietnam, for example. Persia, Iran, was also great hub in the shipping world. It was a powerful hub. It was an economic hub. So that is another example where if you wanted to sail west of Sri Lanka, you really needed to keep the Persians happy. So that is another example of how relationships grew and were formed to better one's own trade relationships with the rest of the world and to facilitate smooth relationships. Now, in the modern world, we do not have the capacity nor the business links to have missions in every country in the world. There are several countries that have not too many missions, but use missions very effectively. And I think one of the best examples is Singapore, that has a limited number of missions, but each mission is designated tasks and is given responsibility to cover a few other regional missions. Another way one can achieve this is if one doesn't actually have a mission in a country, yet to try to build up other types of relationships. It can be a sporting, it can be related to the sporting arena, it can be a cultural thing. And one can also do this with the use of honorary consuls. Good honorary consuls can do a tremendous amount of work in a country. And I think that is another avenue Sri Lanka is looking at to develop links in certain areas. And of course, one must identify areas that are growing. Countries that now may seem as not the most significant or right at the forefront, but we can see its development. And we can project that in 20 years, this country may well be at the forefront. I mean, countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, I think, cannot be ignored in this sphere. 20 years ago, nobody thought India would be where India is, I think. Some Indians may have, but the rest of the world didn't see that. 20 years ago, I don't think most of the world saw China to be where China is today. And of course, the region of Africa. Most other regions in the world have exhausted their natural resources. Which is the continent which is left to us, which is open to us? It is Africa. So these are all areas that we must look into, not merely in the sense of today, but for what the future holds, how the future will shape itself, and where we must position ourselves to make best advantage of that future. This is how I believe a proper foreign policy ought to be formulated. The world is in a very fluid state. No country is static. Some countries may seem as if they are frozen in time or at a particular juncture, at a particular place. But every country is fluid. It is moving from one place to another, some at faster paces than others. But in this fluid movement, one needs to see where the global changes will come and what will happen. The effects of climate change are unpredictable. It can devastate powerful nations that are powerful today. They may recover from it, they may never recover from it. Depends on the extent. Countries that were in the Commonwealth suddenly found, in the British Commonwealth I'm talking about, suddenly found themselves almost abandoned when Britain joined the European Union. It's Britain's role as the the foremost country in the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth, if we may put it that way, seemed suddenly to be abandoned. But what has happened today? With Brexit, Britain may be out. But can Britain go back to that original role it was in at the time most of the British colonies got independence? Perhaps not. Britain may have also changed significantly that it cannot assume that role anymore. So the world is an ever-changing thing. Countries change their policies. Countries change their governments. Countries change their views. And in this context, one of the better examples in modern day times that I see of very good diplomacy is from Cuba, that has managed to get the whole world on its side to oppose the blockade of Cuba. This is good strategy. It is not that Cuba has automatically got itself there. It is due to the way it has planned and positioned itself and won friends and argued its case. And I think I will not talk for too much longer because these foreign ministers tend to get carried away and talk forever. And having myself seen other foreign ministers do that, I will not do that to you on this occasion. But I wish you a wonderful stay in Sri Lanka. I hope you will get acquainted with the country, its traditions, its cultures, its food, and its people. And I hope this interaction will make you all great friends of Sri Lanka and great friends to each other, open doors for you in your respective countries. The key to all this is communication. I think one of the toughest things that we need to do is to break the barriers to communications. If the barriers to communications are broken and commonality can be identified, I think the world becomes your oyster. And in this, I just want to say one more thing, that one of the things I do is I try to, when I go to a country, I try to know about the country before I go. I try to read up and learn as much about a country. And I try to immerse myself in its culture immediately. And when they see you're trying that, there's a natural reaction from the people and governments of those countries to try to help you a little bit more. In fact, when I was in Dominican Republic and Cuba, I found that my limited knowledge of Spanish and my attempt at speaking it, even though very badly, assisted me greatly, because I found the foreign minister of Cuba helping me with my Spanish. After that, there was no choice but to become good friends. So that is really the barrier. The barriers that we have in communications must be dropped, must be overcome, and once that is overcome, commonality can easily be found. When we in the subcontinent, when India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh meets with us, Sri Lanka is the only unfortunate, and Nepal, of course, Sri Lanka is the only unfortunate country that cannot converse in Hindi. The rest of them can. Urdu is also a similar form. So you find all of them chatting with each other, and we are just opening our mouths because we can't communicate, because we don't speak the language. But what do? We start talking about cricket in English, and they all start talking about cricket. So identify commonality. That is the key. Thank you.